So this video is going to go over some playbooks I had written. I wrote two different playbooks for two different operating systems. I'm working on a third for Ubuntu. So right now this is just for RedHat Enterprise Linux 7 and 8. And it's how to deploy the Guacamole application using Docker containers. And quick overview what the Guacamole application is from their website. It's a clientless remote desktop gateway. You can use VNC, RDP, or SSH from it. And what it means by clientless, right, is normally if you wanted to RDP into a Windows server from a Windows machine, you'd have to open up RDP, enter all the information, right? Well, with Guacamole, right, it's web-based using HTML5. So I can install it somewhere, right? And then I can have everyone in my organization, when they want to RDP to something or SSH or VNC to something from anywhere, their tablet, their phone, anything with a web browser, they can head on over to the website that the guacamole.com for my organization. They can log in with their own credentials, and they can connect all these different desktops that I give them access to using Guacamole. And again, it could be from anywhere. It could be from a tablet, a phone, anything with a web browser. So here I have the playbooks I written, right? This is a GitHub repository that I've hosted. You can see here I've got three playbooks, right? One installs Docker, and it's for RHEL7, and one installs Docker for RHEL8. There's some slight differences between these, and that's dependency issues because of the operating systems. And then one's deploy containers. So once you've Docker installed, that's what's actually going to deploy the containers. And if we look at it real quick, it's going to deploy three containers. It's going to deploy one for Apache, one for the database, and one for the actual HTML application itself. And it's going to link that together with the database. All right. So to get started here, I have a RedHat Enterprise Linux 8 machine that I'm going to go over this with. It's hosted in the cloud, so that's why you see a public IP address here. I've already installed Git, so I can pull down the project. I've installed Ansible. So if you don't have a way to install Ansible, like you don't have a valid subscription on a RHEL machine, I've also included instructions in that README in the Git repository on how to how you can download Ansible. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to do a git clone, pull in that project that I showed you, right? And then I'm going to go ahead and do an ls cd in there. And then I'm actually going to open up a project over here on the side. It's going to make it easier to look at these files here. So what we're going to want to do is, right, you're going to want to go through the Ansible config first of all. In here, so I do an ls, you'll see ansible.cfg. So if you buy ansible.cfg, you can go ahead and edit that. I'm going to do it through Visual Studio Code. You can edit, who's the remote user. If you want to vault your passwords, you're certainly more than welcome to do that. Define the file here. Private key you can define. Oops. If you're required to have a private key to SSH into the instances you're trying to deploy these onto. Second thing you're going to want to edit is the host file. Right, you're going to want to put the IP of, or the host name if you have DNS configured, of the host you're trying to run this against. So in this case, I'm going to run it against the host I'm on. Do it like this. If you start getting errors because Ansible, Python, Docker, depending on which versions you have, you could start getting errors that it can't find the right Python interpreter. So if you start getting those errors, you're certainly more than welcome to uncomment this. I leave it commented because I don't need to use it right now, but there are systems where I do need to use it. Oops. So we're going to go ahead and Control S, save that. And that's all you should have to change. So let's go over the playbook real quick, right? So I'm on RHEL8, so I'm going to run this first. I'm going to run docker install RHEL8. It's going to remove the old versions of Docker. The reason there's differences is one of the differences is the Yum version between 7 and 8, right? RHEL7 uses Yum 3, RHEL8 uses Yum 4, so I define that use backend differently in both files. But it's going to remove Docker if it's already installed. It's going to install yum utils. It's going to install device mapper persistent data. If you need LVM2, you can install that. It's going to create the yum repo for Docker C. It's going to add the Docker repo to the yum repos.d, and it's going to enable the repos. And then it's going to do a yum update. In RHEL7, this is going to install container.io because when you go to install Docker, if you don't do this for some reason, there's an error on RHEL7 that it's just not installing container.io for some reason. So I go ahead and install it separately, manually, using a defined URL here. Then it's going to install Python Package Manager, pip2, and then the Docker py, Docker Python module, which is required when Ansible, when you go to run the deploy container here, when Ansible tries to run this Docker module here for Ansible, if you do not have that set properly installed, it's not going to work. So let's go ahead and run the install real quick. So I'll do an Ansible -playbooks -I. I'm going to find my inventory here, which is hosts. And I'm running this against the server's hosts. And if we look at host, servers, the IP I define, and the playbook I want to run, so I'm going to do docker install RHEL7. And then I'm going to define the key because I did not define it in my Ansible.config. And it's going to be key 222, key equals key 222.pem. And actually, before I go ahead and do that, I didn't put the key on this machine. You would provide the full path to the key. Real quick, I'm just going to put the key here in this directory so I don't have to define a full path. Go ahead and bring this up real quick. Paste that in there. Let's see, mod 400 on it. Alright. And now go ahead and run this command here. So that's going to go ahead and install Docker on this RHEL7 machine. So while this runs, I'm going to let it go, and then I'm going to go ahead and come back when we're ready to run the deploy container.yaml. Alright, so now that the Docker install is completed for RHEL7, we can go ahead and run the deploy container playbook. So if I just hit up here, it'll bring up the last command, and then I'll just go ahead and backspace and change this to deploy, tab to autocomplete container.yaml. We'll go ahead and run that, and it's going to go ahead and deploy our 3 containers. So first, it's copying the database initialization file that you should have pulled in over here, the init.db. Ignore the guacdb SQL. And then it's going to go ahead and run this first container. It's going to go ahead and run the second container. It's going to go ahead and link the volume on the host machine to a location within the container. Here's the environment variables, the database, password, user, and those are all defined here in all.yaml. MySQL root password, Guacamole pass, Guacamole user, MySQL database. And then here's the third container. And it's going to go ahead and you need to mount this if you're going to have optional plugins, maybe for a single sign-on or LDAP or something like that. This is going to be the host machine. This is going to be inside the container. And then you're going to have to define a Guacamole home environment variable as well for those plugins for it to work properly. And then it's going to link this container to the other 2 containers as well. So you can see the deploy container playbook is finished running. Let's do a Control L here. And the way to verify that your containers are up is you do a docker ps, right? And I have to be sudo docker ps, right? So these are my 3 containers are up, and how long they've been up. And then we can tell this one's on port 8080. So let's go ahead and check out our Guacamole application real quick. So once you've verified your containers are up with the Docker PS, you're going to go ahead and go to your web browser and you're going to type in the IP address of the host or the host name, the URL if you've got DNS enabled, but it's going to be port 8080/guacamole. It's going to be HTTP, not HTTPS, because the containers weren't configured to run with HTTPS, although you're more than welcome to go through the Guacamole documentation and set that up yourself. But when you get to this initial page, the default login from that initdb.sql script that ran is going to be guac admin for user and guac admin for password. You're going to go ahead and you're going to log in. And the first thing you're going to do once you're in is go to settings, preferences, and you're going to want to go ahead and change the password for this default login. If you wanted to make connections, you would just go to connections, new connection, RDP, you would give it a name. You don't really have to worry about any of this stuff unless you really want to get into the weeds, but you would need to define a host name, a port to connect to, maybe authentication if you wanted to. But it's pretty easy, and then you'll go ahead and save that connection. And then once you have set up a connection and saved it, right, it would show up here. So say you set up a connection to server 1's desktop, it would show up here. And then you could create other users, you could create groups, you could define permissions for those users in those groups. You could determine which, you can see active sessions, and you can determine which connections people will see upon login. Yeah, and that's it. And then maybe in another video, I'll go over how to set up a single sign-on for Guacamole.